I started woodworking, buying wood was very confusing. Hardwood was intimidating. And I thought if I bought the wrong kind of wood, my project was doomed from the start. If you're a beginner and buying wood stresses you out, maybe it's a little intimidating like it was for me, this video is for you. We're going to cover the most important things you need to know about wood, like the types of wood you should be using for your projects and what you should not. We're going to cover how to store the wood properly, and of course, where to buy wood online and in person. And I'm going to show you some mistakes to avoid that cost me some money early on, and how buying this type of wood for projects at Home Depot and Lowe's is perfectly okay, no matter what a lot of people say. Let's go. Before you start, if you'd like, check out anything that I show today, like where to buy these hardwoods and things like that. There'll be a link in the description, the pinned comment, and that QR code right there that you can scan with your phone. Go straight to my website. Now, let's talk about wood. The biggest mistake that a lot of beginners make is that there's a right wood and a wrong wood to use for different projects. That's not the case. There's really only the right type of wood for the projects that you're making. Most wood projects don't fail because you picked the wrong wood. In other words, you pick pine over walnut or vice versa. It fails because of maybe bad joinery, maybe you rushed the job, or maybe your expectations were too high. Building furniture does not require that you have museum grade quality wood to make it. I've made a lot of stuff out of various materials that we're going to cover in this video. What projects require is stable and usable wood. Once you understand that, all of your projects will go much smoother no matter what wood you choose. First up, a lot of times beginners get confused by softwood versus hardwood. So let's clear that up. Softwood is typically woods like pine, spruce, fir, things like that. Hardwoods, commonly used in woodworking, walnut, maple, oak, cherry, those sort of things. There's no right or wrong here, they're just different because hardwoods are typically a little more dense, a little more harder. In other words, they're harder on the surface, they're a little more durable in some cases. But with the more durable woods like hardwood, it comes with a cost because they are more expensive than the commonly seen pine and spruce, things like that. But a lot of people discount pine as being a cheap or inferior wood. It is just not true. Some of my favorite projects that I've ever built were out of pine. I still have furniture in my house that I made out of pine, common southern yellow pine, that we still use to this day. Years later, it's held up perfectly fine because pine is fine. Pine is not just a practice wood. It's not something that you'll use and throw away. This is good quality stuff that you can use and build projects out of. People have been building fine furniture out of pine for hundreds of years. Houses, barns, all made out of pine, especially in the southern United States, still standing 100 years later. Just know that pine is fine. It's okay to use pine on your projects. I want you to know that because a lot of people on the internet will try to tell you that it's not, that you have to go out and buy this expensive wood. You don't. There are applications for this, but you can use pine. It's okay. Now I want to address something because I've seen a lot of videos telling you not to buy your wood at Home Depot or Lowe's for your furniture projects. I'm going to tell you it's okay. I understand where they come from on this, but if you sort through the lumber, because you will have to sort through the lumber and find the good pieces, then you can use that to build furniture projects. I've built a bunch of projects out of pine lumber that come from Home Depot or Lowe's or any other big box store. I built dining tables, end tables, coffee tables, dressers, all kinds of stuff out of common pine that you can just buy at a local big box store. It was very inexpensive to buy the lumber, and I made a really nice, beautiful project with it. So if you're looking at those stores, what you're going to have to do is sort through the lumber. You can't buy the bent and twisted and bowed and cracked boards. You just have to take your time, sort through that lumber. I have spent several minutes sorting through to find 3 boards out of a giant stack of lumber. Now, one of the things I didn't know when I started woodworking was the difference between using softwoods and hardwoods. I was very intimidated to even not just to go and buy hardwood, but to use hardwoods. I thought they were going to be much different working. It's wood. Your blades will cut hardwood, your sander will sand hardwood. It's just harder. The most common hardwoods like maple, walnut, cherry, that sort of thing will work. In other words, cut and sand, that sort of thing, like pine. Very, very similar. Now, they are a slight difference. In other words, it's a little bit harder, so you may have to take it a little slower on your miter saw or table saw, not much, but you might a little. They're going to work very similarly, so don't be intimidated that if you get a piece of walnut in, it's going to be different using it versus pine. It's wood. They all used to be trees, so it's gonna work very similar. Now, there are hardwood species on the market that you can get that will take a toll on your blades and your bits because they are so hard and so dense. But for most beginners, the most common stuff, you don't have to worry about that. Pine has its own drawback because it has a lot of sap in it, so that does build up, especially with the heat of friction on blades and things like that, that you have to clean a little more often. If you're a little intimidated by using hardwood, thinking you're gonna mess something up or to have to work it a different way, don't be. If you can cut pine, you can cut these materials as well. Another thing to keep in mind with hardwoods, really any wood dust, but specifically some hardwoods are a little more of an irritant to your system, especially the dust when it's just kicked up. I know some people get irritated by walnut and then wingay and different things like that. You don't want to be breathing that dust in, so make sure you have proper dust collection or at least a very good dust mask. Let's talk about wood terminology. There's some things you need to know about wood when you start buying it. In other words, what things are called and how they name things. First, dimensional lumber is basically what you buy at the big box store, like this 2x4, 2x8s, 2x10s, that sort of thing. That's called dimensional lumber. And know that a 2x4 isn't actually 2 inches thick by 4 inches wide, which is what that's supposed to mean. It's actually 1.5 inches by 3.5 inches wide, and all dimensional lumber is like that. So a 2x10 is not actually 2 inches by 2 inches. If you go to buying hardwood, before we get into where to buy that at, you buy hardwood by the board foot. In other words, there's a calculation you use to figure out how much board feet is in a board. And I'll pop those on the screen for you, but you can use those calculations. There's also board feet calculators that you can get for your phone, things like that. But basically you're gonna look at the thickness versus the width versus the length. It's gonna give you a board feet. And that is sold priced per board feet. You may also hear 4/4, 5/4, 8/4 when you're looking at hardwood. All that is indicating is the thickness of the board in hardwood. So a 4/4 board is literally 4/4 of an inch stacked on top of each other, which makes 1 inch. So 4/4 equals an inch. All the way up to 8/4, which is 2 inches. You may hear kiln dried or air dried wood thrown around. All of the dimensional lumber that you'll buy at the big box store is already kiln dried, and most of your hardwood at hardwood stores is also going to be kiln dried. They just put it into a giant machine that dries the wood. It pulls the moisture out of the wood to an acceptable level for you to use most of the time. Air dried is simply that. They just stack it outside and let it air dry for a long time, usually about a year or more. You'll also hear in hardwood stores specifically S2S, S3S, S4S. All that means is surface 2 sides, 3 sides, 4 sides. And if you get it surface 2 sides, it can cost less. So they'll actually have one side that's smooth, one side that's rough, where it's been cut at the factory or by the sawmill, and then one edge that is smooth, one edge is rough on a S2S. So you'll just have to clean up those other 2 sides using your tools at home, but it could save you some money. This board specifically is S4S because all 4 sides are surfaced and ready to go. You may also hear or see a lot of projects made out of live edge. That's what this piece is. It has a live edge on it. In other words, there's still a little bit of bark and things like that on it. It's not being cut or milled on this edge. So if you're looking for a live edge table or shelves, or even different projects you can make, like this serving tray with epoxy in the middle, live edge looks really good in there. Made of some of those. Live edge is where it's at. That's what you want for those projects. Now, if you are buying wood at Home Depot or Lowe's, there's a few things you should look for. First, make sure that when you pick out your board, that it's free of cracks, because a lot of times you'll have a crack you'll start seeing on the end of the board, and it'll kind of run all the way down the board, especially on wider boards. The last thing you want to do is buy a board and get home, and when you lay it on the bench, it just basically comes into two, breaks into 2 pieces. I've had that happen. So make sure to look for that crack. Also, any big knots, you want to avoid those. If it's just a minor knot like that, you're fine. And when you're picking out your board, sight down that board and make sure that it's straight. In other words, look down the edge of the board so it's not bowing or twisting or anything like that. You'll also want to avoid boards that have the pith. In other words, this looks like a bullseye on the very end of the board, because that's the center of the tree, and typically those boards aren't as good. Also like to look for consistent grain patterns. Now, if you notice this board here, fairly consistent all the way down. There's nothing really causing any major issues. Sometimes you'll see some that have big knot or something that's in the way that really causes a major problem in that grain. That's typically a warning sign that if you get this, when you cut it in and around that area, you're going to start having problems. So I always just avoid those and just look for consistent grain. Also keep in mind, if you're buying pine in the big box stores like this, they're not going to be 100% perfect. You're going to have a few knots here and there, but that's okay. We can work with those. You can cut around those. You can also include them a lot of times to give a little character to your tabletop. When I built my dining table, my wife wanted knot holes in the top for the character. So a lot of people like those. They look really good in a finished product, but some people don't. Now, if you are buying lumber at the big box store, one thing to be cautious of is SPF, or spruce pine fir, I think is what it stands for. Let me know if I'm wrong. This stuff is a lot brighter in color, almost white, versus this, which is a southern yellow pine board. SPF is used for rough framing. In other words, the studs in your walls or or SPF because it's much more inexpensive, but it is also a lot less dense. In other words, the wood grain in there you can see is a lot further apart, and it's also lighter in weight. It doesn't weigh as much as a pine board. So if you are going to use wood from the big box stores, make sure you're getting pine. I can get this locally, which is #1 pine, which is fantastic. But if you can't, #2 pine is fine as well. Just be careful and not get that SPF because it's just not as durable. It's a lot lighter weight and it just doesn't hold up as long. Oh, and if you're in the north part of the United States, southern yellow pine is like seeing Sasquatch. It's very, very rare up there. I'm not sure what y'all use. Let me know. Let's talk about outdoor projects. What type of wood are you going to use for outdoor projects? Because a lot of people tell you not to use pine. Again, pine is fine. There are other woods that are better suited for outdoor projects, which we'll talk about. But if you are going to choose pine, there's a few things you can do to make your outdoor projects last a very long time. I have built an outdoor sectional, I built outdoor chairs, I built an outdoor storage box, all out of pine. They're still on my deck. They still look really good multiple years later. The key to using pine is properly sealing them and maintaining them. I use a product called Cabot Australian Wood Oil, I think is the name of it. I sprayed this on, and it has lasted years. They still look very good several years later without any reapplication. It just helps seal the wood, protects it from the weather, the elements, things like that, and it just makes it last much longer. So if you are going to use pine, just use a nice quality outdoor finish. Now, other types of woods you can use for outdoor projects that are more durable. They are more expensive, but it depends on the look and what you want out of your project. You can use redwood, you can use white oak, you can also use cedar, cypress, and you can use teak. There's a few others out there, but those are the main ones people use for outdoor projects. One of the most intimidating things I've done in woodworking is going to a hardwood store for the first time because I felt like I was a fish out of water. I didn't know what to ask or anything like that. Thankfully, the owner of the store was very helpful, walked me through everything, answered any questions I had, and in most cases, when you go to a hardwood store, they will do that for you. They're typically very helpful. If they're not, you can find another one because they should be helpful if they're trying to serve the customer. But a few questions you might want to ask is tell them what you're making and have them suggest some type of wood for you. A lot of times, hardwoods are going to suggest maple, walnut, cherry, that sort of thing, especially for cutting boards. Maple, walnut, and cherry are some of the most common types of wood you're going to use in cutting boards. And make sure to ask if it's surfaced, 2 sides, 3 sides, 4 sides, so you'll know that before you buy it. Also ask how it was dried. Make sure it is dry, ready to go. Typically, you want your moisture content below 10% if you're using it, but a lot of times when you go to Home Depot, Lowe's, and buy pine, things like that, even some of these hardwood, it's going to be 10 to 13% in that general range. Maybe a little higher, maybe a little lower, but those are typically okay to use at that point. In other words, build your projects out of it. And why does that matter? Why does it matter about the moisture content? We'll talk about in a few minutes. One very important thing when you're shopping for hardwood in the store is don't be intimidated to ask questions. Even if it feels like a silly question, ask the question because you'll never know if you don't ask. And 99% of the time, the store owner or the employee is more than willing to help you. And when I talk about buying hardwood in the store, a lot of people forget that Rockler, Woodcraft, places like that sell lumber like this in the store as well. So it's also a good option if you have one close. The great thing about going to a physical hardwood store, if you have one, is you can pick out the grain patterns, you can look at all the boards, get a real feel for what you're buying versus buying online, which is a very good option if you're like me and you have no hardwood stores anywhere around you, at least within 90 miles. And I think buying hardwood online is one of the best options for beginners because you can get a selection of wood at a reasonable price to start using and know how to work it because hardwood does work slightly different than softwoods. In other words, it cuts a little different, it sands a little different, that sort of thing. If you are going to buy online, I would highly recommend just checking out Rockler. I'll link to some of my favorites in the description and the pinned comment to help you find these easier. But you can buy 3/4 inch by different lengths of walnut and maple and cherry at Rockler. And it's a really good option for you if you don't have a hardwood store and you just want to get started using those hardwoods. You can get those online very easily. And the good thing is they go on sale fairly regularly at Rockler. Or we've made it even easier. I've partnered with Old Log and Sawmill. We have these charcuterie boards, serve and tray kits of live edge boards that you can buy. They're dried, ready to go. And what's great about this, every picture you see is the actual kit you'll get. So if you click on a listing and tab through those pictures, those are the boards you're going to get. So you'll actually get to see the wood grain that you're going to get. You'll actually get to see the live edge that's in there. So this is a good way to get different things for charcuterie boards or serving trays, things like that. And we have cutting board kits of walnut and maple, different mixes, so that you can build a cutting board. If you don't have planers and jointers, this is a really good beginner project for you. And if you do buy some of these serving tray kits or charcuterie board kits from Lowe, they also sell epoxy as well. So if you do want to make some of those really nice serving trays, you can pick up the epoxy at the same time. I've been working with Lowe for a long time. Went up there and toured a shop several years ago. Very good people. Again, both Rockler and Lowe is linked in the description and that pinned comment to help you find them easier. Let's talk about buying plywood, because there's a bunch of different kinds of plywood. Also MDF, there's a bunch, they're called sheet goods. If it's a sheet of a piece of wood like plywood and MDF, we call that sheet goods in woodworking. But it can be confusing when you walk in, you see like stacks of plywood in the big box stores, or even in hardwood stores that sell some plywood. You don't know what to buy for the projects you're gonna get. All plywood is it's plies of wood. In other words, layers of wood glued together, pressed down. It makes a very stable material to build a lot of different things out of. There's a lot of things you can build out of plywood. I built my miter station out of 3/4 inch plywood. I built most of this workbench is plywood. I also built my daughter a very nice dresser out of plywood. It's a very good material to use for projects. Now, if you are going to build furniture out of plywood, like dressers and things like that, I would highly recommend just buying sanded birch 3/4 inch plywood. Now, all sanded birch means is both sides is like a sanded top. It's what it feels like. It looks like it's smooth. There's not a lot of voids or knots or anything like that in there. It's a nice looking piece of plywood called sanded plywood. You could also get sanded oak, plywood, and different things, but I like the look of the birch. That's what I built most of my furniture with in the shop. Now, there's also something called Baltic birch you may see. It is a much higher quality plywood. It is also much more expensive plywood. It has more layers, and the finish or the top is much better. It doesn't have any knots or anything like that in it. Sanded birch is a little cheaper, good quality. Baltic birch, kind of the best of the best type thing. You also may see things like CD plywood. What that means is it's going to be a lower grade of plywood versus that sanded plywood. You can build some things out of that, but if you do want a better look, you would probably want to go with the sanded plywood. And typically with CD plywood, it's going to be, a lot of it will be bowed and things on the shelf. You'll be able to see it on the shelf being bowed. So you want to try to avoid any plywood, no matter what it is, that already has a bow in it, because it is very difficult, if not impossible, to get that out once it happens. Typically what causes that is it's gotten wet, and now it's dried again and it'll bow up. Another thing to note about CD plywood, or any of them that have those stamps on there, C and D are grades of wood, like A, B, C, D. So C would be kind of mid, and then D would be kind of, you're almost failing. So you want to keep that in mind if you're buying CD plywood. One side will be better than the other. MDF is also a good material in some cases. It is basically a bunch of wood fibers like dust compressed and glued together to make sheets of wood, basically. I've used MDF in a variety of things. I make a bunch of different style templates out of MDF, but I also made the top to my router table out of MDF. So it's a very versatile material, although very dusty. It's also not a very good material, in my opinion, to build cabinets or shop furniture out of. For one, it's very dense. It's very heavy, especially the thicker pieces. And it just doesn't hold up as well because of how fibrous it is. It's just sawdust glued together. So if it does get wet, it's ruined and it breaks a little easier, and it doesn't hold screws as easy as plywood, things like that. So I would avoid it for furniture. Also, when buying plywood, it's very important to look at the edge of the plywood and look for any voids. A lot of times in the lower grade plywood, you'll see a layer of the plywood didn't adhere to the other ones, and it'll break out and it'll create a void in there. You'll want to avoid the void on that plywood. Let's talk about acclimation. Wood needs to acclimate to its environment. And this is pretty important that a lot of people kind of skip over. If you buy wood locally, so if you live in the same town as your Home Depot or Lowe's, and you run up there and you grab some boards, it's probably fine because you're in the same general environment. But if your shop is heated, cooled, that sort of thing, you do need to bring it in and let it sit. How long should you let wood acclimate? Probably a couple of weeks if we're being like the best case scenario, but at least 48 hours, worst case scenario. But I have been guilty of going up there and grabbing some wood and coming home and building with it right away. It's typically fine so long as it's in the same general area. Now, if you do buy wood online and it's shipped to you, you absolutely need to let it acclimate, because the purpose of acclimation is to let the wood get used to the environment it's in. Humidity and temperature change can cause wood movement, and we'll talk about movement in just a minute. You need to let it settle in your temperature and humidity environment before using it. Let's talk about wood movement, because this is a giant myth I think going around woodworking a lot, is wood movement is going to destroy your projects. Most likely not. Wood movement is typically seasonal and very minor at that. I've built a bunch of stuff. I've never had wood movement destroy anything. Now you might see, if you do a breadboard in during certain months of the year, you can feel one board up over the other. But 2 months later, it's perfectly smooth again because wood is moving, but it's moving at such a small amount, it's probably never going to make a big difference. In my experience, it's a bunch of hype typically about wood movement, and I'm sure people in the comments will come at me on that. But for the most part, 99% of the time, your project's going to be just fine using the wood. As long as you let it acclimate for a couple of days, use it, it's probably not going to move enough to even matter. The only major issues I've ever seen, especially online, is if someone's building a cutting board and they don't get the glue on there good enough, typically is what happens. But the wood movement does cause those to crack a little bit. Or if they run it through a dishwasher, it's probably not a good idea. I'm not a wood movement conspiracy theorist. I just think it's overblown. Yeah, it does happen. It can cause problems, but 99% of you will never have a problem with wood movement so long as the wood is properly dried, kiln dried, and doesn't get wet before you use it. Now let's talk about wood storage because that's very important. For a long time in this shop, before I had any of this stuff here, I had concrete blocks I would lay down on the floor and put the wood on and stack concrete blocks on top of the wood to keep it from moving, and it worked. Because if I buy this wood at Home Depot or Lowe's and I come bring it home and let it set for 2-3 weeks, a lot of times it starts moving a little bit, and I didn't want it to do that, so I would just stack a bunch of weight on top of it. You can do that. It's perfectly fine. I've also stacked it on shelves, things like that. What you want to avoid in wood storage is putting this directly on the ground. You don't want that, even on concrete, because concrete holds moisture in it, and then the wood will absorb that moisture. So don't put it directly on concrete or the ground. What I would do is just cut some scraps and lay those down, and then put the boards on top of the scraps. That's what I always did. You also never want to store it in direct sunlight, because if sun is hitting it at different angles, different times of the day, that's going to cause it to heat up and cool down, and it's going to start bending and cracking and all kinds of good stuff. So if you can get it out of the sunlight, do so. You want to try to keep it out of damp environments. You also want to support it equally along the way. So if I have this 8-foot 2x4 here, about 7-foot 2x4, I would want to support it maybe a few inches from the end and then every 6 to 8, 10 inches across there, because if you just support it on two ends like this, wide apart, especially if it's an 8-foot board, it'll kind of bow in the middle. Not kinda, it will. I've also stored a lot of my wood, especially the thicker stuff, vertically, which you'll see a lot of hardwood places, even Rockler, Woodcraft, hardwood stores store it vertically. It's perfectly fine. It's perfectly fine to store it vertically. And plywood I store vertically as well. You just don't want it to have a large angle because it will also bow. You want to kind of keep it as straight up as possible, but also still safely leaning. One of the best things I ever did for my shop was put in some storage racks for lumber. I have 2 of them. They're fully stocked. You can get these fairly inexpensive, and they hold a lot of weight. There are 2 supports. Remember I said 2 supports wide apart. These are fairly close apart, about 3-ish, 3.5 feet. And storing 4-foot, 5-6-foot boards on there, I've never had a single one bow, and I've had several up there for a long time. So if you really want to get organized with some really good racks, I'll link to these in the description and pinned comment. Buying wood does not have to be scary. Pine is fine, hardwood is great. Buying wood at the big box stores is okay. Online kits make things a lot easier, but the biggest mistake is not building because you're intimidated or a little worried about buying the wrong wood. Start building. That's the most important thing. You're never going to get better. You're never going to get more knowledgeable using these woods if you don't start building. If this video helped you at all, or if you learned anything, or if you didn't learn anything, let me know in the comments. Otherwise, click that box right there, Woodworker 101, all the terminology you need to know about woodworking and more. Click that box, get you the big old virtual fist bump.